I'll definitely would like to discuss all sorts of question that comes to your mind at the end of my lecture. First of all, let me tell you that uh, Robinson Crusoe as a text incorporates many themes. I mean, it is really a vast and very significant fiction in the long-standing genre of novel. I mean, there are many important themes that Robinson Crusoe uh, posits. First of all, the tradition of realist fiction, the idea of political allegory, various economical interpretation of Robinson Crusoe, and so on and so forth. So there are vast themes and question that Robinson Crusoe posits in our mind. But in this one particular lecture, I'm not going to talk about because it would be burden for you if I talk about all those themes in just one lecture. So what I'll do, I'll talk about in a specific manner and specifically focus on the island. I mean, even after finishing the fiction, or even after considering all those major tropes and elements in Robinson Crusoe, there is one thing which is very central in Robinson Crusoe, that is the island, right? So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the island as a space and how that island could have economical, societal, or even a psychological interpretation, right? So the lecture going to be uh, uh, focusing on the island and how Robinson Crusoe uses that island, right? So this would be in a very reductionist sense my talk would focus, right? And at the end, as I mentioned, that I definitely discuss all sort of question that comes to your mind, right? Now now yes, now since the introduction of Robinson Crusoe uh, in the literary circle and in the uh, wider readership in 1719, Defoe's The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York Mariner has worked its way through numerous editions, translations, and recastings. So the influence of Robinson Crusoe is enormous. I mean, it is not only a fiction. I mean, obviously it is a fiction. So it is not only a fiction, but it has been adapted and translated and even re-visualized in many cultures, in many literary traditions. So the influence or the aftermath of Robinson Crusoe is immense in that sense, right? And from early bestseller, an example of English novel, or in more precise sense, English realist fiction, it has become a cultural referent and even a childhood classic. I mean, uh, at the end of the day, Robinson Crusoe is an adventurous story, right? It is a fiction of adventure, and numerous children are definitely got attracted to that all sort of adventure, adventure in Robinson Crusoe, right? So indeed, it is as deserving as any work of the label so-called quote unquote modern myth, right? And it is a fact even pointed out by a number of book readers, including Virginia Woolf. I mean, you all know about Virginia Woolf, right? I mean, Virginia Woolf, that famous modern novelist. I mean, she once mentioned Robinson Crusoe as the modern myth. And if not it ends. I mean, there are other admirers of Robinson Crusoe too. I mean, in the volume of Emile, written by Rousseau, uh, 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 he had given one copy of Robinson Crusoe to his pupil, Emil. And Karl Marx, I mean, from Virginia Woolf to Rousseau to even Karl Marx, invokes in crucial and biting fashion this beginning of capital. Marx also mentions Robinson Crusoe. So you could understand that Robinson Crusoe as a figure attracted a wider generation of readers as well as various novelists, critics, social historian, and so on and so forth, right? So the book had many sequels too. And not many recall much about its narrative beyond the protagonist marooning on an island. That central image has reverberated far and wide. I mean, Crusoe washed up on an unfamiliar shore, facing the world alone. I mean, this is how in many of the sequels and in many of the recastings of Crusoe that took the central image of Robinson Crusoe, who has been washed away on an unfamiliar shore and then facing alone all the obstacles and troubles of that island, right? So several facts are worth underlying in this regard, right? Before turning the work itself, I mean, before going into the story, before going into any interpretation, these are all those important historical and cultural and literary facts that we need to keep in our mind, right? First of all, while Robinson Crusoe can be labeled as fiction, it was written at a moment of transition in genre and presents itself as an authentic story, striving to evoke the believable over fantastic. I mean, this is the particular age. Obviously, I'm talking about 18th century, and when Robinson Crusoe and Daniel Defoe marked a particular transformative era from fantastical genre to the genre of realist fiction. So the idea of realism, if I'm not exaggerating, then the idea of realism is actually somehow structured. I mean, the idea of realism and a genre of realism is somehow structured by Daniel Defoe and particularly Robinson Crusoe, right? And this fiction's literary tropes in future becomes the very marker on tropes of realist fiction, right? So a number of historical accounts of marooned sailor surround Defoe's text. I mean, it is not that Defoe for the first time introduced this sort of adventure. I mean, before Defoe, there are 2-3 texts that could be taken as the source material of Robinson Crusoe. Let me give you an example. The example of Alexander Selkirk. Alexander Selkirk. I mean, this is another important figure who also talked about and wrote about this sort of adventure. So it could be true that this famous book of Alexander Selkirk could be a source material of Defoe's Robinson Crusoe as well, right? Now, at the very beginning, Robinson Crusoe proclaims, particularly in his preface, that it is just history of facts, quote unquote. I'm quoting from the text, that just history of facts without any appearance of fiction. This is important thing to note. Crusoe and Defoe in his preface proclaims the fact that this particular novel would be just history of facts without any appearance of fiction, right? Second, Crusoe has numerous adventures before arriving on that island, and has more after leaving the island too. He is taken slave before he takes his own, and founds a plantation in Brazil before his fateful voyage, right? So as a general portrait of an era, his fictional biography represents something beyond the idiosyncratic. This is the morning, or this is the age, or this is the great age of sugar plantation, of the painful triangle between Europe, Africa, and Americans. And Defoe himself was quite interested in the colonialism of his day, right? So if we mingle these two things together, I mean, if the book proclaims as such that this book would be a history of facts, and at the same time, if we incorporate all those historical data, archival materials at one point, then it would be, it would be, uh, it would be certainly a kind of fiction that represents the time, that represents the time of sugar plantation, the various expedition of European countries, their settlings in various African and American countries, and so on and so forth. So in one way, it actually suggests, it actually refers to the colonialism of that day. So it is also historically correct. And the idea of realist fiction, the idea of realist fiction, or the idea of realism, seems very much true in the case of Robinson Crusoe, right? Thirdly, the work was immensely popular at the time of its appearance and was quickly translated into other languages. The first French edition appeared in 1720. So you could understand that after 1719, it had been published in English. And then in 1720, with a quick response, the book has been translated in French. So you could understand how much popular Robinson Crusoe was that even today. I mean, it is also true that Robinson Crusoe is very popular even today, right? So thus, while Robinson Crusoe may be an English novel, one influential in reflecting and defining national character as well as the novel form, it is also echoed throughout the novel, right? So it could be a very much English novel, it could be a very much Englandish novel, but it is somehow in broad represents Europe, and Europe's national culture. And eventually, in a twist particularly germane to the story, it inspired Jules Verne. You all know Jules Verne, that famous sci-fi novelist, and that famous French figure, or Jules Verne, who also considered as the father of science fiction in French, right? Who in turn served Robinson Crusoe as the hero to Rocketeer. So, as I was mentioning before, that Robinson Crusoe had an immense impact on every sphere of Europe and obviously across the globe. And this instance of Jules Verne and his reusage of Robinson Crusoe again provides that same impetus, right? Now, considering all these facts, considering all these elements and themes and questions that Robinson Crusoe entails, as a literary work, Robinson Crusoe has been read in a number of ways. But two of the most influential traditions are this: that treat his exile on an island as a spiritual or psychological trial, and those that focus on his behavior as economic man, the classic bourgeois script of society. I mean, these are the two things that I would like to focus here, right? I mean, I'm not going into all those details, I'm not going into all those cultural artifacts and its reenactment and so on. Rather, I'll be focusing on two issues: how the exilic space, if I term it so, the exilic space, that means that island has been or could be observed in two ways: in economic terms, in societal manners, and how that economic terms provided us an insight into the idea of civilization and its discontents, if I put it like this, and then how that island or that exilic space could be observed in spiritual and psychological way as well, right? So these two things in my lecture today I am going to discuss, right? So Robinson Crusoe, at the center of his story, is a man out of place, learning to improvise, right? Marooned on a small tropical island, his horizon limited and surrounded by exotic flora and fauna. And this non-technical man, I mean, we could definitely term this as non-technical man, because he has always traveled only as a merchant. So he doesn't have all those knowledge of technology and so on, right? So this non-technical man, surrounded in a limited and exotic flora and fauna, must rebuild his life all alone. So almost for 20 years of his exilement, he lives with constant thoughts of elsewhere, repenting his past, dreaming of liberation, and dreading cannibals as well. And yet, by this time, he acquires his man Friday, not to mention his later retinue of Spaniards and English sailors. We'll not discuss all those things. Rather, we'll be focusing on that island and his relationship that has constructed in that island, right? So we'll not go into all those Spaniard or English sailor and so on, right? Now, yet by this time of 28 years on that island, Robinson Crusoe acquires his man Friday. He has become sovereign and in an odd way native and dictating not only the political terms of the island's administration, but also the technical terms of his settlement, right? He builds himself a wall, one between England and tropics, one that bears the mark of his hand, right? So the island, which once inhabited, which once completely deserted by man, now with the help of Robinson Crusoe, or with the urge of surviving in that island, Robinson Crusoe builds a completely different world, even constructed some relationship and so on in that island. So the island in Robinson Crusoe is not a neutral figure. I mean, the island does have various interpretations as well. I mean, the space of island should not be considered only as an island where Robinson Crusoe continuously working. Rather, that island could have various interpretation that is obviously related to Robinson Crusoe and other characters, right? So Crusoe marooned is a man painfully displaced, right? Yet he has in some senses always been so, a point worth underscoring. As he tells us on the opening page of his tale, his father was a foreigner of Bremen, and the very name Crusoe is a corruption of Kubzener, right? And throughout his life, he craves adventure, physical as well as economic. So Robinson, that is why, goes against his father's design to place him in the upper station of low life. And I mean, this is how Robinson Crusoe and his career has been defined in the text: upper station of low life, right? So his father wished to place him in a condition between labor and luxury, most suited to human happiness, right? But time and time again, when settled in one local or another, he always uproots himself and sails off. Yet his sojourn on the uncharted isle, his farthest displacement beyond the bounds of society, in the end brings him closest to home. Once wedded to his island, he can never leave it, returning at the end of the book to inspect it again and bearing everywhere its mark on him. So Crusoe, not only being displaced at that island, but at the end of book, when he revisited again in that island, actually bears the mark that he makes the space as his own terms, right? So it is the central experience of his life, that one that defines him as a character. Okay, so Crusoe, despite his taste for adventure, does not remain an explorer only. He becomes, however unwillingly, a colonialist, right? I mean, he uses the space of island in a such way that obviously very close to the ideology, very close to the imperial ideology or the approach of a colonialist. This condition separates his account from many earlier travel tales of adventures and merchants, Odysseus to Sinbad, right? I mean, if we just cross-reference to this earlier story of adventure, I mean, Odyssey and Sinbad, definitely these two are the adventurous story. But if you closely look at these two adventure story, then this two adventure story of Odysseus and Sinbad, there were wars, death, loss, various supernatural happenings, various divine appearance, so on and so forth. But the adventure of Robinson Crusoe is very much different to the earlier depiction of adventures of merchants like Odysseus and Sinbad, right? This Englishman, Robinson Crusoe is definitely Englishman, right? So this Englishman not only encounters the exotic, not only encounters the island, but must learn to live with it on a daily basis in a state of uneasy mastery. That's the main point. The Englishman not only encounters the exotic or exoticism of the island, but make it in his own terms. So always leaving a mark of mastery of an Englishman on that island, and this is what the mastery will be more looking at, right? So the explorer has come to rest, and in proving himself cosmopolitan, he reworks his body and soul, and the island inspires Crusoe to the closest encounter with both spiritual anguish and the material conditions of life. I'll come to this point, I mean, that spiritual anguish later, but first I'll focus on this material conditions of life, how the very materiality of that island has been encashed by Robinson Crusoe, right? So it is here that he, who has never been a religious paragon, begins again to pray. Here that he, who has never been a skilled worker, learns slowly and awkwardly to husband the land, to control the land, and to make all he needs. And following his shipwreck, he is initially beset with the terror of his predicament and his condition of isolation leads him to refer to the setting as the island of despair. Sick, he loses track of his time, but even as he relentlessly calculates it, his attempts to flee the place only leads him to embrace it more fully, right? Yet he takes heart in his work, in his improvement. Defoe devoted pages to consider, if occasionally in haste, the technical aspect of Crusoe's struggle to reconstitute a familiar life. And this idea of familiar life, this making his own of that island, is very much close, is or can be interpreted in another way, that imperial ideology. Let me tell you two, three very important things. First of all, you all know about modernity. I hope you all know. I mean, you must have encountered with the idea of modernity. Now, what is modernity? Let me tell you in very brief, that modernity, I mean, it has many implications, it has many interpretations. But modernity, in Western sense, refers to some attitudes, behaviors, features, culturally, socially, and politically, that could be only observed, or that could be only standardized by the respect of the British people. So the concept of modernity becomes the tools of the European people to oppress, to suppress, and to legitimize their colonization, right? So modernity in that way becomes a form of discrimination, becomes a form of legitimization of power, right? Now, how and why this is very much applicable in the case of Robinson Crusoe? Now, let me tell you another important thing. I mean, I'll definitely will trade all these things together at the end, but just listen to me carefully. There is another concept called Aufklärung. Aufklärung. It is not an English word, it is a German word. Aufklärung. That means enlightenment. And there is an essay written by Immanuel Kant, which is called "What is Aufklärung?" Right? So, what is enlightenment? Now, in that essay, Kant defines Aufklärung or enlightenment as the end of civilization into maturity. It is an historical process, according to Immanuel Kant, which will finally lead to maturity. I mean, every civilization obviously works or requires enlightenment, and that enlightenment will eventually lead them into maturity as a civilization. And this maturity, or this enlightenment, or the end process, would not come in a day. It requires help of the leader who knows better things, who knows important things, or who knows how to control, how to lead into that end, right? And this particular essay becomes the very philosophical basis of colonization. Why? Because if enlightenment does have a connection with a leader who can lead his civilization into maturity, then the British people justify the other civilization like African, Caribbean, or the Indian as the non-civilization, as the civilization which has been marked by barbarianism, which has been marked by lack of knowledge and maturity. And that is why these countries, or these nations, including Africa, including Caribbean, including New Zealand, American at one point of time, and obviously India do need the support and the assistance of British people. So the very colonizing process is not a dominating process. I mean, if we follow the idea of modernity, if we follow the idea of Clarence or the idea of enlightenment, then the process of colonization or the system of colonization doesn't become the very mode of operation, rather it becomes necessary. So this is how the European people justifies their way of domination, their way of suppression, or their way of controlling things. Now the question remains why this is very important in the case of Robinson Crusoe. I have said, and I have mentioned in my lecture before, that the island, when Robinson Crusoe is being shipwrecked and forced to live in that place, he makes that island in his own terms. When he meet Friday for the first time, he tries to pursue or even sometimes threaten Friday to make him like in his own ways. So the shipwreck of Robinson Crusoe strands him in unfamiliar surroundings, bereft of any human company. It simultaneously provides him with initial provisions, and this means to re-establishing his mastery, including seeds as well as the essential carpenter's chest, ammunition, and arms. Right? I mean, the island should not be seen only as a very neutral space, but the island becomes the space where Robinson Crusoe, as the colonizer, reacts, works, and makes his own. I mean, this was that imperial logic. That British or the European nations and civilization put on the or put forward on the other nations, including Africa, Caribbean, New Zealand, America, and India as well. Right? So Crusoe lands with a chest of tools as well as rudimentary knowledge of their own uses. And for all that, the island is exotic, an initially mysterious and threatening environment. It provides him to empty ground to claim for his own. Its tropical climate supports game animals and allows the practice of agriculture. Thus, we can say that Crusoe's effort to civilize the island rest on imported elements, both technical and natural, and finally cultural. These are the things he recognizes and holds on to, tools and ways of being that he will pass on to others. Right? First, see the example of his servant Friday, and then the Spaniards, and then even the English mutineers who takes his place. And to live on his island is live as like Crusoe, to adapt his ways and habits, as well as to walk the same ground. I mean, see that after Crusoe, whoever reach on that island, even it is Friday or that Spaniard or that English mutineers, all somehow have to abide, have to maintain what Crusoe has led them into, right? So, however, relentlessly focused on individuality, Robinson Crusoe revolves around a discovery of colonial social order through its lack and the necessary condition of its recomposition. Right? So, what is this social order? Before us, we have a single male, right? I mean, before everyone, Friday or the Spaniards or the English mutineers, we have only one single male, an European traveler or an English merchant who was completely aware of his national origin, his language, his religion, and he started to categorizing others and himself, alternatively certain and uncertain, where sovereignty lies. He judges, he defers judgment to, he calculates, he whips, born between high and low. He is placed by the fact that he can act as both lord and bondsman. And all these characteristics of Robinson Crusoe, all this element of Robinson Crusoe, all this working and performance on that exilic space of that island, Robinson Crusoe provides us ample elements that could certainly uh, certainly uh, suggest to those earlier forms of colonialism, right? So, and uh, uh, this is the reason Crusoe not only uses new techniques when he confronts with a new and wild land, he also does acquire a servant, and after getting the servant, he names him. Right? I mean, the name of Friday was not actually Friday, right? Even that name Friday was being given by Crusoe himself. So by renaming himself, by renaming Friday as Friday, Robinson Crusoe took the position of a master in that colonial society or in that hierarchical societal order, right? So social mobility and hierarchy emerge in tandem in Robinson Crusoe. One commoner becomes king, right? One commoner, I mean, before everyone, Crusoe was also a commoner. Crusoe was also a mere Englishman. But that one commoner, if you closely observe, then he becomes king, and another acquires the debt of life that will make him a slave. Crusoe, I mean, with that same logic, Friday should also be the master, should also be the king, but that doesn't happen. Robinson Crusoe becomes the only king, whereas all the other characters in Robinson Crusoe in that exilic space of island becomes only his subject, becomes only his uh, uh, subordinate, right? So we can say that the idea of modernization, the idea of mobile man, the idea of displaced agent, of an Englishman, of an English merchant who carries all those little technical knowledges, not only transform the surroundings of that island, but also significantly transform the life of the others. The space of the island significantly is not an imagined isolated space, but the space becomes the very space of performance for the British European colonial masters, as with them they brought the idea of modernity, they brought the idea of enlightenment, or they brought the idea of civilization. They tried and somewhat forcefully transform the life of the other people. The empty horizon of the island, and its cannibals and the others subject by the influence of Robinson Crusoe, with his knowledge of English language, with his knowledge of Christianity or Bible and other important elements of Christianity, transform the very space of island into a colony, right? So as the fiction at the very beginning proclaims the fact that this fiction would be a matter of facts, where no other imagination or fantasy would not be allowed. And if we incorporate all those historical facts into our discussion, then we could easily say that Robinson Crusoe and his adventure, and finally his life in an isolated exilic space of the island becomes the representation of the earliest form of colonialism, right? Now I'll go into other ideas. I mean, I have mentioned in my lecture at the very beginning that I'll be talking about on the idea of the space, on the idea of island as a space, not only in terms of economy or in terms of politics, but I'll also come into the discussion of psychology or spirituality or the other perspective as well. I mean, the island could be understood in other perspective as well. I mean, so far we have only discussed the island in terms of politics or in terms of economy, right? But it does have other important connotations as well, right? So the exilic space in Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe is represented by the island onto which the main character Crusoe shipwrecked on his way to Guyana to bring back slave for plantation, right? Now our main goal is to analyze this exilic space, right, and its symbolism throughout the novel by comparing the island's appearance and abundance, along with Crusoe's thoughts and actions, with the works of authors such as Baudrillard and Kristeva, because these two critics or theorist idea would, if we incorporate into our discussion, then we can have a completely different interpretation of that island, right? Now see that the repetitive theme in the novel is that of slavery and the depiction of a white man as a civilizing agent for the black colored savages, right? I mean, we encountered it once when Crusoe escapes slavery himself, and his exilic journey takes him along the coast of Guyana with a black boy named Zuri. I mean, I'm certainly talking about the previous experience of Robinson Crusoe before got displaced into that isolated island, right? And again, when Crusoe, once having spent several years on that island and adapting to it, shapes a black savage, which he later names Friday. Now, in this both cases, I mean, in the case of Zuri or in the case of Friday, in this both cases, Crusoe is seen as superior or master white man who tries to convert them to Christianity and teach them to be civilized. He owned it to be just and offered them a kind of medium, right? And in that process, Crusoe turned them into Christian, right? So as Friday is not only an uncivilized colonizer, if I put it in that way, but he was also a cannibal, right? He was also a cannibal. So his conversion from cannibalism to Christianity may represent a purification process in which cannibalism is seen as an object of defilement, quote unquote, defilement. And he tries to prohibit, I mean, Crusoe obviously tries to prohibit this practice in Friday and convince him that it is an act of defilement. Now, while this case of defilement or this idea of defilement is very necessary or is very important, because if we briefly introduce the theoretical idea of Julia Kristeva, then Julia Kristeva describes this purification rite in her work, Powers of Horror. Kristeva wrote a book called Powers of Horror as being, I mean, this purification rite from all those cannibalistic practice or all those practices that are not supported in so-called civilized society as being that essential ridge. I'm quoting from actually Kristeva. I'll definitely make it more clear with simple words. But look at the very words of Julia Kristeva. She said that essential ridge which prohibiting the filthy object extract it from the secular order and lines it at once with the sacred facet. Because it is excluded as a possible object, asserted to be a non-object of desire, abominated as an object, as abjection, field becomes defilement. It is little complicated. I know it is little complicated and little difficult too. But let me make it more clear to you. What Kristeva tries to make us understand that this very process from various practice that has not been supported or that has not been sanctioned in the symbolic order or in the civilization or in the so-called civilized society is actually related to the idea of filth, to the idea of defilement, right? Now, Crusoe makes sure that before making Friday a Christian or before making Friday a civilized subject, this process has to be followed, right? I mean, this is why this is important. Why I'm very much emphasizing on this fact on or the idea of Kristeva here, because this is the process by which the colonialist masters uh, projects their power on the colonized country or the colonized people or the colonized nation. Now, if you take Friday as the typical representation of a colonized subject, then his conversion process from cannibalism to the subject of Christianity have to be have to be have to be uh, 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 gone through this process of purification, right? I mean, first of all, Crusoe makes sure that Friday never practices cannibalism by first providing the custom in an explicit manner, then offering the explanation why he should not practice cannibalism. Because a civilized subject, a civilized subject does not, or a civilized subject does not practice all these primitive forms of life, all these primitive societies or their religious rites needs to be purified by the hands of the civilized subject like Robinson Crusoe, right? So in that book, the excluded element is that of cannibalism, which represent both secular filth and religious defilement, is being excluded from the normal area of social conduct. And through abjection oriented towards practice, first of all, Rousseau makes it clear that the practice of cannibalism is nothing but disgust, right? Then he tries to prohibit it in a secular way, and that secular way includes even threatening to kill Friday if he ever eat human flesh. And finally, that religious sentiment where Rousseau explained through Christianity why this practice is considered abominable. And actually, this three process, I mean, uh, 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 by producing the idea of disgust, then the idea or then imparting the idea of secular, and finally the religious purification, what uh, what suggest is that it is the three structure by which a civilized Englishman like Robinson Crusoe purifies the cannibal and colonized subject like Friday, right? And this is very much objectionable, right? This is very much objectionable. I mean, Christopher rightly points out that this very process of abjection, then becomes the form of uh, uh, subjection, the form of discrimination, the form of repression, right? Now, finally, I'll talk about the last idea, and then I'll end my lecture and obviously take question from you, and how I'll be very much interested to know what you have understood from my lecture. I mean, definitely I'll do that. But before I want to briefly talk about another important issue that Baudrillard underlined. Now, Jean Baudrillard, who was one of the important postmodernist thinker, theorist, and critic, underlined about America and the uh, uh, and the capitalist wealthy completely glossy America, in the sense that he uses America as a dystopia. I mean, we all know America as a country of various opportunities, technological development, capitalist center, and so on and so forth. We all know that. But Baudrillard, in his his own way, sees America as a dystopia, a place of corruption, of moral and physical decay, a simulacra of another life where intelligence and spirituality is mutilated. So Baudrillard said that America is not a country that we can see in our naked eyes. Rather, it is nothing but a nation more close to dystopia. It is a place of corruption. It is a place of moral and physical decay. It is nothing but a simulacra, a Xerox copy, an unoriginal form of another life, where spirituality is mutilated, frozen, and turned into visual effects and used for advertising. So the reality of America is nothing but a hyper reality. It is completely cut off from the actual reality. It is completely cut off from the actual representation of people and their lives. Now, if we take this idea of Baudrillard, America as the city, America as the country of simulacra of original life, simulacra of original reality, then how this idea of Baudrillard we can also observe in the case of the island where Robinson Crusoe has been displaced. It is completely the opposite, right? It is completely the opposite. I mean, if in Baudrillard's idea, America is nothing sort of simulacra or the hyper reality or a nation of dystopia, then the island that Robinson Crusoe was there and exiled and lived for almost 28 years is nothing but a place of utopia, right? Even after Crusoe naming that island of despair, at the latter half of the novel, Crusoe starts to enjoy the richness of the island and makes a home to his liking. Also, he is no longer at the mercy of the basic temptation or moral defects of human, such as greed, materialism, and more importantly, he finds God and develops his spirituality at that island. I mean, so far we have explored the idea or the space of island in a very different way, right? We have explored the idea of island in economical terms, political terms, in terms of colonialism, and obviously the idea of Cristobal we have also introduced, right? But there is another positive thing as well. I mean, if we take Baudrillard's idea, then the island of Robinson Crusoe would be the antithesis what America was for Baudrillard. This island of Robinson Crusoe rather provides Crusoe to discover spirituality within him. And although we cannot we cannot ignore the fact that Crusoe was obviously materialistic, right? Crusoe was obviously materialistic, but the way Crusoe at the end completely enjoys and making his own, that island becomes a space of spiritual discover as well, which the modern society definitely lacks. So in my conclusion, the exilic space presented in Robinson Crusoe can be seen as a space of self-development and growth as well, as it contributed to Crusoe's mental, physical, and later or social development. Right? I hope you have enjoyed my lecture. Now, if you have any question, please ask.
Thank you, Dada. So, now students, if you have any questions or thoughts that you like to be clear, get it cleared by our sir, so you can ask that question to him. So, anything related to the text, or if you give your feedback right here, uh, because we are fortunate that he has taken the labor to come to in your front, so to teach you on Robinson Crusoe. So if you ask questions, so you will understand that you really are attentive. It's a
Yes,
it's a
yes,
difficult take.
please feel free. Yes.
Yeah, feel free. So at least one or two question we can expect from you.
Okay, if you have any language problem, you can ask in Bengali as well. I'm completely fine in Bengali. Please. তোমাদের যার যা কোয়েশ্চেন আছে জিজ্ঞেস করো, বাংলা ইংরেজি যেভাবে পারো, বা কি বুঝতে পেরেছো, এখান থেকে কি বুঝতে পারলে সেটাও জিজ্ঞেস করতে পারো।
So Sritama, Ria, ভাবছে বাইরের থেকে স্যার এসেছেন, আমরা যদি এখন বলি স্যার এখন হেসে দেবে। হাসাহাসির কিছু নেই।
না, তোমরা জিজ্ঞেস করো,
ঠিক আছে, হ্যাঁ
ডেফিনেটলি
বলো।
বলো তোমাদের
না
মনে যা
স্যার, তেমন
প্রশ্ন
কোনো
আছে।
কোশ্চেন নেই।
আচ্ছা, বুঝতে পেরেছো আমি কি বলতে চাইছি, সেটা বুঝতে পেরেছো, কি কি বলতে চাইলাম? একটু ছোট করে বলো দেখি, তুমিই বলো। কোনো অসুবিধা নেই, বলো বলো।
কেউ কিছু বলবে না? এতক্ষণ ধরে স্যার বললেন, এতজন রয়েছে, 42 জন। সীতমা, so you at least say something, or Ria. Anyone? It's strange. স্যার তো বললেন বাংলা ইংলিশ তোমরা যেসে কমফোর্টেবল ফিল করবে তোমরা কোশ্চেন করতে পারো। তোমরা কোশ্চেন না করে তোমরা ইনফরমেশন নিতে পারো, সেটাও পারো।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ,
যদি
একদম।
কোশ্চেন করতে হবে সেটাও স্যার বলেননি, তোমাদের যদি কিছু জানার থাকে আর কি। না দাদা, এরা কোশ্চেন করবে না, তবে এটা থেকে আমরা বুঝে গেছি এরা পুরো টেক্সট বুঝে নিয়েছে এর আগেই। হ্যাঁ, এটা একটু আরো একটু এক্সট্রা অ্যাড হলো। এত কিছু পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে টেক্সটটাকে অ্যানালাইজ করার চেষ্টা করেছো তুমি। সো I think they feel happy, that they feel fortunate that this they you have tried to analyze the text from all these perspectives. So thank you, Dada. And if later on if I get questions from them, so I will forward them to you. So
Definitely.
if you get time, then so you please respond to those questions.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I think they don't have any questions right now.
All right.
Okay, so we can end the talk here. And thank you very much.